Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Break the Glass Identity Governance, Cloud Provisioning for a New Era. I am Mackenzie Dean with Becker's Hospital Review. Thank you for joining us virtually today, and we hope that everyone is staying healthy and safe. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation, and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into the Q&A box you see on your screen. We look forward to hearing your questions. Today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. You can use the same link used to log into today's webinar to access the recording. At this time, I'd like to welcome our two fantastic presenters. We're thrilled to be joined by Wes Wright, Chief Technology Officer for Imprivata, and Randy Nail, Modern Workplace Director for Microsoft. Randy, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely, and thank you. So, again, my name is Randy Nail. I am a director in Microsoft's U.S. healthcare business, and I focus mostly on our modern workplace solutions. And really what that's all about is helping with the two-way connection between our healthcare customers and Microsoft as a whole, so that the solutions, the products, the technologies that Microsoft brings to market are relevant to the needs and regulatory requirements and those sorts of things for all of our healthcare customers. So thank you for having me today.
And I am Wes Wright. I am the Chief Technology Officer at Imprivata. I've been here about a little over 2 years. Prior to that, I was the Chief Technology Officer out at Sutter, and that's where Randy and I got to know each other. Me and my team did a big digital transformation exercise out there, and Randy was my Microsoft guy that helped me with that. And since I've moved over to Imprivata, he's also my guy who helped form the Microsoft partnership that we've had several announcements on. So, hey, thanks for being there for me, Randy.
Absolutely. Happy to, as always, Wes.
We had been planning this session for quite some time, and then what happened was a little something called COVID. And we saw that this is kind of what has happened in the market conditions for the healthcare delivery organizations. COVID hit hard, and hopefully we'll see it trace off like this red line depicts. But then what happened was this incredible spike in virtual care and actually sending remote workforce out to I remember working on the health delivery organization side. It was almost verboten to speak of sending folks home to do their work from home, because we couldn't tell productivity, and we couldn't do this and we couldn't do that. Well, nothing like a good crisis to help drive home the ability for people to work from home. So we had those two things happening, and then all of a sudden we also had for lack of a better term, the collapse of the non-emergent care. I mean, for good reason. We didn't want people coming to the hospital, because the hospital is where folks who potentially had coronavirus were hanging out. So we stopped all the non-emergent care. And unfortunately for most of our joint customers out there, Randy and mine, that's actually where health delivery organizations, for lack of a better term, make their money, using air quotes. And this is where we're kind of seeing the market conditions at this current point in time. We are starting to see non-emergent care come back. COVID is going down. Virtual care and the remote workforce is still a little higher than I think it's going to settle out on. Myself and our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Sean Kelly, have a kind of an arm wrestling match on where that virtual care line is going to end up at the end of this crisis. I think it's probably going to be, maybe double what it was previously, which I think maybe previously we were at 5 or 10% virtual care, and Sean thinks it's going to be a lot higher. One thing I do know is that remote workforce is going to consistently stay a lot higher than what it was previous to the coronavirus. Randy, I'd be curious to hear your opinions on this line and this graph.
Yeah, thanks, Wes. So I think that makes a lot of sense, and I probably would place my bets with your chief medical officer. He and I think, maybe have a similar viewpoint, and that is people are forming new habits right now during this crisis, and some of those habits are just going to carry over because they represent, a convenience, a lower cost in many cases, a better access to care in some cases. And so I think, the virtual care growth, maybe it falls off some initially, but the things that we've learned during this crisis, I think, are going to help us carry over and do a better job, help adjust the regulations and reimbursements and all of those kinds of things that, in addition to convenience and access to care and those things have to happen as well. And I think the lessons learned from this are going to help there also. The lessons learned are going to help our technology, right, that exists out there, including some of the pieces of the technology that we're going to talk about today. So the technology is going to get better. I think all those things together will drive a steady increase in both virtual care and remote work. And I know a big part of what both Imprivata and Microsoft are doing is trying to make sure that our technology platforms are ready to support our customers as that happens. So I sort of disagree with you there, Wes, but I think I'm going to place my bets with Dr. Kelly.
Well, Dr. Kelly has a doctor in front of his name, and that kind of means he's probably a little smarter than me. So I don't mind that you make that bet with him. I wouldn't mind losing to him, as a matter of fact. But I think it's an interesting thought experience, and I really think it's one of those it depends answers. And I think the depends is it depends on how long CMS is going to continue to pay the same reimbursement rate for virtual care visits for virtual care visits as they have for the in-person visits. And if they continue to do that long enough to form those habits, like you talked about, Randy, then I do think it might tick up a little further than I think. But CMS is broke, and I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't stop doing those reimbursements within the next 3 or 4 months. And I'm not sure that was long enough to form that habit. But it's an interesting thought exercise, and something we can't do a webinar without talking about our current conditions. So I figured we'd start things out with this. Now back to our identity governance topic, which is incredibly relevant even in these market conditions. This is how life used to be. It used to be people like Dr. Kelly would go into a hospital and log into a workstation and connect to usually a fat client app on a workstation and connect to their EHR. But things have changed. Things are changing even before COVID. The number of users and roles that occur in healthcare has exponentially increased. And they want to do healthcare from all different kinds of locations with all kinds of different devices. And because they're using all kinds of different devices, they're using all kinds of different types of applications. And so from that small little piece there, we've now got these multipliers of complexity out there. And then you add in the COVID-19 response, the hyper that made things really super duper hyper complex, I guess, and that along with those users and roles, hey, all of a sudden you've had to, and this is where a good identity governance system comes in, all of a sudden you've had to move some of those users out of the roles that they were in into different roles, and then hopefully when that red line goes down far enough, then you'll move them back to where they were in the first place. And without a good identity governance system in place, you don't know who got what done to whom and who has what access to what. And the different locations, I think we could both agree on that blue line, Randy, that we combine virtual care and remote workforce. While I think, and we can disagree, it's okay. Well, I think that the virtual care line is going to come down. I really don't think that remote workforce line is going to come down, mostly for two reasons. One, I think we have gotten that habit formed. And two, can you imagine the place that you used to work in, the place that you used to go into, how are they going to create and maintain a 6-foot social distancing? It's just going to be so complicated that I think we're going to see that remote workforce continue to grow. What are your thoughts on that, Randy?
Yeah, we certainly are in agreement there, Wes. All of the sort of context that you provided, I think, is spot on, and it's what we're seeing at Microsoft as well. I know this is a bit from an Imprivata and your CTO and healthcare background, but speaking from a much more pervasive technology company, that is also delivering solutions outside of healthcare as well as within healthcare, we're absolutely seeing this. Whether you look at our growth in our teams, our growth in virtual desktop, the growth in meeting minutes, the growth in document sharing, you can look across the board at the services that are being used by remote workers at Microsoft. And it's very telling, and I agree with you. It's not going to go away, and I believe we'll end up in some sort of hybrid scenario, right? So we already think about hybrid as being on premises and in cloud, and I think the next sort of axis of hybrid is going to be remote work and work from home, right? And so you'll have kind of this sort of 3-axis version of hybrid going forward, and I also agree with your premise that the more that we add, the more axes we get, the more complicated digital identity gets, which is why this webinar is so relevant.
Yeah, and that's interesting. Randy, I hate to put you on the spot. We didn't rehearse this or anything, but do you have any stats off the top of your head? Like I've heard some phenomenal numbers in like Teams growth and WVD growth. Do you have any of those off the top of your head that can kind of illustrate what you were just saying about?
Yeah, Wes, I should have the stats in front of me that I'm able to share publicly versus those that, for privacy reasons, we need to sort of keep internally. And in my head, I'm not sure that I could share the right ones in the right bucket. So in order to stay out of jail, I'm with my own organization, I think I'm going to take a pass, and perhaps as a follow-up to this webinar, if there's some additional collateral, we can certainly lay that in there. But you're right, it is phenomenal growth, right? And it's growth to the point that we were actively managing capacity for teams in our data centers across the world as new customers were coming online. And literally customers and new users were coming online so fast that we had to add additional capacity just to do the provisioning. So that'll give you at least sort of an idea of the scale at which our primary remote work tool set for communication and collaboration and replacing the in-person sort of work experience is Teams, as you know, and so that'll give you an idea at least from the growth of Teams. So yeah, you have to add capacity just to add capacity, kind of thing. So
Yeah, since I'm with Imprivata, I can guesstimate, or I can rumor control some numbers that I've heard, and that's somewhere around a 700 times growth in Teams use, and a 6 times growth in Windows Virtual Desktop use. I mean, it's just phenomenal. That's, the part of the title was about the cloud and the break the glass provisioning. And it's not just with the user provisioning. It's like you said there, without the cloud, we never could. Microsoft, never could have accomplished what you got accomplished from that incredible exponential growth that you've had in those remote workforce products. But I think if nothing else, like you said, Randy, managing that digital ID, that thing in the center that ties all of those planes together, this slide used to say is as important as ever, but I actually think it's way more important than it ever was, because of the super duper hyper complexity that the COVID crisis has introduced. I mean, you were bringing on, or Microsoft was bringing on, 700x new Teams members, and we in healthcare were bringing on new nurses and new doctors to help with the COVID crush, and they had to get the right applications and have the right access to those applications, and we had to enable this secure access for the remote workforce, and this is all around digital ID, and most importantly is that last bullet, is that you need to be able to prove when this is all over to your auditors and to your compliance people that you did manage those digital IDs, that they did have the right access to the right applications with the right authorizations. And because digital ID is so central to everything we do in healthcare, and not just in healthcare, of course, but particularly in healthcare, we've taken to say, and this, Randy, was the saying when you and I worked together at Sutter, that identity is the new perimeter. Well, we're actually taking that a little bit further and say it's not just the new perimeter, because we've destroyed the new perimeter with all those roles and users and devices and different places. I mean, the perimeter is gone. And the only way you can control that access to applications and data is through that digital identity. So it's not just a new perimeter, it's a new control plane. And our partnership with Microsoft and in the digital identity management control plane is something I'm pretty excited about. And this slide really illustrates that partnership. Randy, what do you think? Oh, I just got a note that Randy's audio died. So I'll tell you what Randy thinks. Well, this is Wes's interpretation. We're living in a hybrid environment. As Randy said before on a previous slide, we're not only living in the hybrid environment of on-prem, off-prem, we're living in that hybrid environment of remote work and on-prem work. Remote work and in an ambulatory or a home care setting work. And it's through this partnership that we have with Microsoft that we think that we're providing one of the most comprehensive digital identity access management suites. Randy, if you're back, you got any thoughts on this one here?
Yeah, Wes, I think the idea here is that while Microsoft's identity platform, sort of Azure Active Directory and Active Directory and all of the pieces that fit in and around that are, what I would say are the most comprehensive on the market, that Microsoft has the most comprehensive digital identity ecosystem, available today. And even with that, we can't solve for all of the use cases in all industries and their specific scenarios and those kinds of things. It's just not possible. And I think the beauty of the partnership with Imprivata is that Imprivata's focused on the healthcare industry. You guys have spent, I've been working with Imprivata, I don't know, I can't even count the number of years now. And, I'm from Louisiana, and we have trouble counting that high sometimes. But
Hey, isn't that a coon's age or something like that?
Something like that, Wes. But, the point of that is Imprivata has always been focused on healthcare and the healthcare use cases. When I talk to, for example, Dr. Kelly, your CMO, who you mentioned earlier, it's clear that, Imprivata is always thinking about the clinical workflow, the livelihood, the daily sort of activities and things that doctors and nurses and therapists and other clinicians need to get done, and how digital identity interacts with that. And so, again, in our partnership, Imprivata is able to take Microsoft's digital identity ecosystem and then extend that and make it, highly relevant for those clinical scenarios, such that digital identity, not only does it not get in the way of the workflow, but digital identity actually enhances the workflow. It actually allows the technology and tool sets and features and functions that we talk about that we want to use to digitally enable and digitally transform healthcare. It allows the delivery of those things into the workflow of that healthcare worker in a way that makes their day faster, easier, more relevant to patients versus all day long sitting in technology. I love some of the stats that you guys have from your customers around the time saved and the minutes back to care for patients. And between Microsoft and our digital identity ecosystem that we call Azure Active Directory, and the capabilities that Imprivata builds that integrate into that ecosystem and make it relevant for those healthcare use cases, I think that's the power of this partnership. And I think together, we have a digital identity system. Not only is the best that there is, but can truly make a difference for our joint customers.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Randy. And here's even outside of identity governance, where we're working with Azure, a couple of more places that we're working together is with something Microsoft calls seamless SSO, and Imprivata, because we're marketing geniuses, we call healthcare seamless SSO. And that's enabling that shared clinical workstation that has been out there in the healthcare environment for years and years, and now enabling our clinicians to actually get access to their O365 productivity applications and not have to wait to go back to their office. And the shared mobile devices, the tap in and tap out capabilities with the single sign-on into Teams and Outlook. These are just some of the initial integrations we're doing with Microsoft to really build to capitalize on each other's platforms. Randy was saying that from a horizontal perspective, Microsoft, and I believe this, has probably the best identity and access management suite of tools in the industry. But our partnership, Microsoft's an inch wide and a mile wide and an inch deep, and by putting Imprivata on top of that platform, we go a mile deep into healthcare.
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy, Wes. I think that's the right way to think about it, and I think that's the right way for our joint customers to think about it. Get your digital identity, horizontal platform in place with Microsoft, and then use the Imprivata integrations and the Imprivata tool sets to then enable clinical and other healthcare workflows on top of that. And you sort of get the best of both worlds. I really like that analogy.
Yeah, and I think because Imprivata is 100% focused on healthcare, we're talking about the healthcare vertical. But I'm sure that there's somebody out there in petroleum and somebody out there in finance that is taking that same platform and running it a mile deep in their vertical as well. And that's that's the power of the horizontal play that Microsoft is doing right now, in my opinion. So here's the Imprivata Identity Governance Solution. It's an end-to-end solution. I sometimes slip up and call it the cradle to grave, which is not a good term when you're talking about healthcare. So I go soup to nuts, beginning to end, alpha to omega identity management system. And it all starts with that onboarding, and then the automated provisioning, the attestation and remediation. This is something that I think is really unique to healthcare, is that when you provide access to somebody, to an application or a data source, HIPAA tells us that periodically, and not defining periodically you have to get reauthorized to have access to that data. And with Imprivata's governance and compliance and risk management pieces of the product, we make that easy for healthcare. I think this is a tremendous example of that horizontal plus vertical platform, because Microsoft, they don't have the time, the resource to delve into the reporting and compliance mandates that healthcare has. Imprivata does. So the combination of the Imprivata Identity Governance Platform with the Microsoft Azure Active Directory Identity Management gives you a complete identity governance solution set. And this slide here gives you the connection points of how we are going into Azure Active Directory and provisioning both into Office 365 and Azure Active Directory, where you can then take advantage of the Azure Active Directory identity management tools. But down in the clinical workspaces and those non-LDAP aware applications, we rely on the Imprivata Identity Governance Solution. So we've said hybrid a bunch of times, but hybrid identity management and governance for healthcare is the new norm. Randy, I stole this slide from you. I'm wondering if you can walk us through this one.
Yeah, absolutely, Wes. So the idea here is that across the top, Microsoft Azure Active Directory is, has a set of capabilities that are based on open standards and that are pervasive throughout, the modern application architectures and the way that they leverage identity and access management. So things like SCIM for provisioning and deprovisioning and that sort of thing, like OpenID Connect and SAML for authentication in modern apps, those kinds of things. A pre-integrated set of applications that is a catalog over 3,000 strong that Azure Active Directory can already be the identity provider for natively right out of the box. And so that's kind of that top layer of the diagram that you're seeing here. In healthcare, however, nice. There's a ton of traditional applications, whether those are clinical applications, business applications, homegrown kinds of applications. All of those applications, as you noted, don't always follow, open standards for identity management. And even when they do, as you mentioned earlier, the number of roles that you might have, the different roles that a single person might play, depending upon what shift they're working, what project they're on, those kinds of things. You need a more healthcare-centric, a richer, more healthcare scenario-aware system to be able to accommodate all of those different applications, those different roles, those different workflows, and to govern those, right? And so what this diagram is trying to show is that together with when you put together Microsoft's identity platform and Imprivata's identity governance solution and Imprivata's access management solutions, you have a unified identity that you can govern, right? That you can do those attestations, that you can do those access reviews, that you can make sure that people have the right access to the right things. And that one tool can be used to govern the entire that entire ecosystem that I just talked about, because of the work that Imprivata's engineers and Microsoft engineers are doing on the back end to make sure that our tool sets work together. And I think, you know, if I had to sort of call out one thing that is kind of the secret sauce for this integrated environment, is that we're working, when I say we, Microsoft and Imprivata are working to make sure that these integrations are there on behalf of our customers, so they don't have to do all that integration work. They can just expect these things to work together nicely in their environment.
Yeah, that's a great point, Randy, that I almost missed missing. And as you were talking, it popped into my head. Oh yeah, we got to talk about this integration thing. You know, that we both Microsoft and Imprivata, you know, we don't want our joint customers having to cobble this stuff together themselves. I mean, that's what you and I had to do when we were working together at Sutter, is figure out how we can get some of this stuff integrated there at Sutter. But there would be another health system over here and another one over there and another one over there that were figuring out completely different ways to do those integrations. And once I popped over to Imprivata, it just made no sense to me that we had, you know, 2,000 healthcare organizations out there trying to figure out how to do these integrations themselves. And so you and I got together and went, wait a minute, let's try and do this at a corporate level so that we build these integrations at the warehouse and then ship them out to our joint customers. So all our joint customers have to do is integrate our two products. Maybe they're already integrated, but if they take some configuration at the site, then we give them like IKEA type of instructions on how to put the integrations together. You know, and it sounds sort of altruistic. It makes sense for people to do that, but really, it really helps both of our organizations out as well. Because if we know how these integrations, you know, at the factory, we know how these integrations are supposed to work together, then it makes it an awful lot easier to support than everybody doing their own gig. You know, though, I get a lot of questions when we talk about integrations. I get a lot of questions of Imprivata Identity Governance and MIM. You know, I get some. Do they compete together? Or do they compete against each other? What's the integration potential look like? And it's kind of an elephant in the room some of the time. And I'm wondering if you can take a shot at this elephant in the room, Randy.
Sure, Wes. I think it's. I actually think it's pretty straightforward. I mean, at first glance, you know, you would someone might look at this and say, "Hey, Microsoft Identity Manager is an identity lifecycle toolset, and Identity Governance or IDG from Imprivata is a lifecycle management toolset." And so, you know, I think it's easy to sort of look at that and say those are competing products. However, you know, I think about them more as complementary products. And this is what I mean by that, is if you're a customer and you already have Microsoft Identity Manager in place and you already have it connected to your business and clinical applications, and, you know, you want to then get some additional integrations, you may still want to bring in IDG. And you may want to do that for two reasons. One is IDG has got more out-of-the-box connectors and connectivity that's easier to implement to proprietary healthcare applications than Microsoft Identity Manager does, right? So if you've already built those integrations on Identity Manager, then keep them. There's no reason to go, you know, replace those if they're working well. But if you're going to go add application X, application Y, application Z, it's more likely than not that IDG is going to be much easier to implement those new integrations to those kind of traditional proprietary, however you like to think about it, healthcare applications, especially if we're going to do role management. The second part of that is there really is no governance in Microsoft Identity Manager. So a big part of what IDG brings to the table is that governance, and that currently doesn't exist in Microsoft Identity Manager. Microsoft made an acquisition of a company called Behold a while back, and it had pieces of governance, and some of those things were folded into Identity Manager, but many of those were not because they didn't meet the requirements. For one reason is they didn't meet the requirements of some of the vertical industries like healthcare, and so if you want to get governance, you're going to need to add on to the Microsoft Identity Manager if you already have it, and a great product for that is IDG, like you've talked about previously, Wes. I think the second thing that customers may want to have Microsoft Identity Manager in the mix for is consolidation of their Microsoft environment. So there's a lot of mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, that sort of thing that go on in the healthcare market. And when you do that, you have multiple independent, you end up with multiple independent Active Directory instantiation, so multiple forests, multiple Azure AD tenants, those kinds of things. And Microsoft Identity Manager, one of the things that we've built into it is the ability to sort of enable consolidation of those environments and coexistence of those environments. So, MIM may be in place for there as well. So I think there's a place for MIM if you already have it. You don't need to rip and replace it if it's working well for you. You just augment it with IDG. And then, if you need to do a bunch of, consolidation or coexistence work between multiple Microsoft and multiple instantiations of the Microsoft, identity system, then MIM is good for that. Over time, in Azure Active Directory, we are going to build some additional governance capabilities in there for, I described it earlier as the modern open standards-based approach to identity. There will be some governance stuff in there. We've started some of it already. So if you go look at Azure Active Directory today, you'll see some governance things in there about access reviews for access to cloud applications. But, there's none of that exists in the Microsoft system today for those on-premises, again, proprietary, traditional, however you like to refer to them, applications. And even as we extend that capability for governance in Azure Active Directory in the cloud, we, much like access management and lifecycle management, there are going to be industry-specific scenarios like healthcare, like clinical workflows, like multiple roles that a clinician might have depending upon what shift they're working, that the Microsoft ecosystem just isn't going to have out of the box because we're a horizontal platform, right? And I think that's, again, where partners like Imprivata, really add value. So that concept I talked about earlier where you have the Microsoft Digital Identity Platform that's extended to industry vertical scenarios, Imprivata in healthcare, I think that applies to this identity governance, lifecycle management, provisioning, deprovisioning, all of those kinds of things, Wes, just like it does to access management. So I think, again, our partnership story here is really, really strong.
Yeah, and I think like the slide says, IDG and MIM are actually complementary and not competitive to each other. And kind of as a last piece, as a last few, people, why Imprivata Identity Governance in Azure? And I think just with the last two slides there, Randy, you explained really well why Imprivata Identity Governance in Azure. Not just the connectivity to Azure, but we did an announcement a couple of weeks ago, I guess, that now Imprivata supports running identity governance actually in Azure, so that our joint customers can take advantage of the scalability and agility that running things from the cloud provides. To me, and I feel this in my bones, Imprivata and Microsoft together are better for each other in healthcare. We provisioned 4,000 users in 3 days, and with this joint identity and access management solution, the number of FTEs that you can free up to do clinical IT work and not this stuff that should be automated is phenomenal. And identity governance really pays for itself in almost no time. And I think, Randy, I'd like your opinion on this too. I think this is the time that, throughout my career, I've tried to put in an identity governance system and multiple places that I've been, and I just couldn't find the want for it. There was the urgency was not there. But I think, you go back to that very first slide that we did in this webinar, and you'll see that COVID has changed things. I think what we're going to see is a lot of CTOs, CIOs, and particularly CISOs are going to lift their head up and go, I moved this person from here to there. I couldn't keep track of it. I brought these people on board. Wow, did they leave? I really need an automated system in order to not do this again, in order to not make that control plane of digital identity more like a sieve than a control plane. And so I really think over the next maybe 6 months to a year that these identity governance products or projects are going to put a stake in the ground and say, no more. We have to get this right, especially in healthcare. I'd really love to hear what you think around that, Randy.
Wes, I agree with you. If you look around, the healthcare industry and really beyond, you'll find a lot of partially completed identity, lifecycle management and governance projects.
Yeah.
And I think there's two reasons for that. One is the ROI was really hard because of the time it took to implement the lifecycle and governance solution, right? So by the time you get that done, the ground is shifted under you, and there's just too long of a time horizon before you get the return. The second reason is that getting the connectivity that you needed, the integration that you needed to all of the different applications that you needed to connect to was really hard. It was complex work. It took a lot of, custom kind of work, lots of consulting hours, those kinds of things. And I think, we solved for both of those on behalf of our customers. I won't say that it's perfect. It's certainly not perfect. We continue to work to make it better, but we have largely solved a bunch of that. So with Azure AD and its sort of as a service connectivity to a catalog of 3,000 apps, built-in SCIM connectors to popular cloud applications for provisioning and deprovisioning. There's a ton of stuff that's just out of the box and will just go to work for you as a customer. You don't have to do anything. If you think about that from the clinical healthcare perspective, IDG is the same way. I've heard, stats from you and your team and your customers that talk about, being able to get IDG stood up in, 4 to 6 weeks and connected to your primary, EMR and your primary HR system and the Microsoft ecosystem and, those fundamental kind of things in a very, very short amount of time. You go back 2 or 3, 4 years, that was unheard of to be able to have that kind of, pervasive integration in an identity lifecycle and governance solution in that amount of time. So I think we've, gone a long way towards solving that. And then on the complexity side as well, with your bridging technology and its ability to sort of reach into those, one-off kinds of applications that exist in healthcare, I think, that goes a long way, as well as kind of the open standards and SaaS model have both gone a long way toward reducing the complexity. And so I agree with you. The time is right for, if you're a healthcare provider, an integrated delivery network, a regional health system, I think the time is right for you to sort of take a look and say, I think the ROI is there now. I think the ability to implement very quickly is there now. And, I think to your point, we got to get this right as we continue to get more complex with this work from home, work remote, virtual health, all those kinds of things. So I think the demand is there, and I think we've solved for, or at least mostly solved for, two of the key problems with identity governance and lifecycle management. So I agree with you. The time is right.
Yeah, and back to that one slide, digital identity, it's not as important as it ever was. I think it's way more important than it ever was, and the only way any institution is going to be able to get a really good handle on that digital identity is using an automated identity governance, risk and compliance system, and like you said, not one that takes 2 or 3 years to stand up, but one that takes 5 or 6 months to stand up.
Yeah,
and with that,
I'll go even further before we turn it over to Mackenzie and say that, you mentioned the recent announcement that IDG now runs in Azure. That even further reduces the time and complexity because, you don't have to buy, install, provision, maintain, operate infrastructure, right? I mean, that lowers that time even more. IDG can be up and running in Azure no hardware to buy, provision, replace, that sort of thing. It's ready to go. So that reduces the time even further.
Yeah, we went from days for an on-prem install to hours for an Azure install. So, we're looking, both Imprivata and Microsoft are looking to bring the highest time to value ratio that we can bring in an identity governance system, and it takes a bit, and I'm sure we're going to get a heck of a lot better than we are now. But we're getting close to time. Mackenzie, I'm going to turn it over to you and see if there's any interesting questions out there.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Wes and Randy, for such a great presentation. We'll now begin today's question and answer session. Please submit any questions you have by typing them into the Q&A box you see on your dashboard. We will try to get through as many questions as we have time for. The first one is about the provisioning process, and this audience member is asking, does the user need to come to the facility to be provisioned?
Generally, no. This is Wes. Generally, not generally, no, but 100% no. With this COVID thing, the less people, and I hate to say this, but the less people-to-people physical interaction that we can do, the better off we are. And even to the degree, another one of our products, electronic prescription of controlled substances, we can actually now do that provider identity proofing, something that the DEA mandates, virtually as well. So we could actually get a clinician up and running, provisioned into, let's say, Epic to the EMP SER level with EPCS capabilities, all done virtually.
Wes, I'll take that even further and say that we, during this, even before the crisis, but especially during the crisis, we've seen customers be able to, get a direct ship, Microsoft Surface tablet or, Dell laptop or whatever, without any sort of custom imaging or anything, shipped directly to, their remote employee. That employee boot the thing up, get it connected to their home Wi-Fi, and autopilot take over and get that end device configured, make it safe and secure and optimized for corporate work from home kind of use. And if that identity is provisioned into some sort system or manually entered through some ticketing system, either depending upon the configuration and the integration, IDG and or Azure Active Directory can take over and get that user the right identity with the right access, get it connected to that autopilot configured Surface device that was direct shipped to them, and they can be up and running, safe, secure, compliant in a matter of, hours without ever setting foot into any office. And we've got examples of that happening throughout our customer base, as I'm sure you do, Wes.
Yeah.
Over and over again during this time of crisis. Again, we were having customers do that before, but this crisis has really sort of demonstrated that is possible, and not only possible, but has significant advantages over the traditional sort of way we used to do things with imaging and, bringing people into an office and having them sit through and custom configure things and all of that. So absolutely, you can do it. You can do all of that virtually.
Yeah, and not to mention what you can do with a Windows virtual desktop, where you can even avoid that shipping lag time.
Absolutely, and have them use their own device and still maintain the safety and security through that virtualization layer and all the protections that are built into the Imprivata stack and the Microsoft Windows Virtual Desktop stack. Absolutely. So we call that sort of non-managed access to corporate devices in a safe, secure, and compliant way. So that's absolutely possible as well.
Perfect. Well, I appreciate you both weighing in on that question, so thank you. The next question is from an audience member who asks, is the Azure offering an Azure service, or are we just running IDG in a VM in our tenant?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I would say,
go, Randy.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question, and I would say there's a current state and a target state, right? So in the current state, essentially what happens is the infrastructure gets auto-provisioned in Azure, and the IDG toolset is laid on that infrastructure, and it runs mostly the same as it would in a traditional on-premises environment. And there's some advantages to that. One is Imprivata and Microsoft could get it to market really fast because there wasn't a lot required to make that work. And then the other advantage is, as customers want to run a hybrid environment where they want some things on premises and some things in the cloud, that approach also allows easy, almost seamless. I can run it in Azure, then I can bring it back on premises, and I can push it back into Azure if I need to, or sort of move it around. So there's that advantage there. But it does have some sort of disadvantages, right? The disadvantage is you still have to, manage, maintain, and run all those Windows servers and SQL servers that sit underneath IDG. So the target state and the thing that, Imprivata and Microsoft will continue to work on together is an environment where IDG runs in Azure in a more service-like approach, so that it eliminates that underlying requirement to do all that extra work. I don't know, Wes, if you had, I don't know if you guys can share any timelines or anything on that, but I think from my perspective, having it the way it is currently running on IaaS is certainly a benefit, right? It's faster. I can have multiple test environments. I can clone my environment. I don't have to buy and maintain the hardware and all those kinds of things. I think that has some significant advantages, but I think that, there's more advantages to come. I'll turn it over to you to talk about, I'm not sure what your guys' timelines or anything are on that.
Yeah, we're still a ways out, but I appreciate that you started that out is with we have a current state and a target state, and 100% we want to get our identity governance solution running in a platform as a service mode, and not so much an infrastructure as a service mode. That advantage, that time advantage that I had mentioned earlier in the presentation, just getting it there and to auto spin up in your tenant in hours rather than the days it used to take to install it on a VM in your physical data center, that's a huge time savings, and we're looking for that to happen probably within the next 6 to 8 months with IDG. But even more exciting for us is our porting of our one sign appliance, our access management single sign-on appliance into Azure, which moved over from the medium track over to the fast track. So that one, I think we'll be seeing some announcements on that one coming pretty quick too, Randy.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Wes. And I agree with you on the IDG sort of, getting it for on behalf of our customers, moving it more toward platform as a service will provide some additional benefits. But there's a tremendous amount of benefits today. I know just really quickly when I was on the customer side, kind of doing these things. One of the things you always want to do with your identity governance and lifecycle management is when you want to make a significant change, you need to do some testing and some validations. And getting a sort of lab environment was really hard. Getting a lab environment in Azure it couldn't be simpler, right? You just clone the thing and do your testing and your validation. When you're done, you just shut it all off and put it back in the pool and stop paying for it. So there's some definite advantages of doing it in the cloud, even on IS.
Perfect.
Great. Well, it looks like we have time for about one or two more questions. This next one is from an audience member who's asking, what is the scale of effort needed to successfully introduce and build out a solution, and are third parties needed in that process?
Let's see. We have something that we've just come up with, something we call a quick start package that the scale of effort is 120, it's either 120 or 130 hours of Imprivata professional services, and that'll get you an Azure deployed identity governance system hooked up into Epic, into Exchange Online, into Azure Active Directory. I think one other app running 4 or 5 different roles, and we think that we can do that in 4 or 5 weeks. So it's quite an extraordinary time shrinkage from what we generally think an identity governance product would take. Now, on a normal install, as I think I mentioned before, we'll do very much less prescriptive than that, but we'll do 5 or 6 applications, 10 or 15 roles, and get you hooked up auto provisioning into those 5 or 6 applications. And we've done that in 5 to 7 months. And Imprivata is a software company. We want you to use our software. We do services, and we exclusively do the installation for our identity governance product, so that you can start using that software sooner rather than later. So no, there's no third-party services needed whatsoever. Now, if you're going to stand it up in Azure and you don't have the skills right now in your shop to do that, we can recommend some people that we've worked with that have those Azure skills, and I'm sure that your Microsoft folks can help you with that as well.
Yeah, Wes, we actually have an Azure Enterprise Skills Initiative where we are helping our customers, extend and pivot their skill sets that they may already have managing on-premises infrastructure and platforms and things into Azure, and that's available from Microsoft. And it's a program that we provide to our customers, and so there's your Azure skills. You use the Fast Start program that you talked about, and I think anyone who's tried to do an identity lifecycle management and governance project in the past will realize just how fast that is to get time to value.
Yeah, it's incredible. I'm very proud of it.
Wonderful. Well, that is all the time that we have left for today. I want to thank Randy and Wes so much for such a great presentation, and Imprivata for sponsoring today's webinar. Please enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to having you join us for future webinars. And one last note, there are some questions still that were not able to be answered during the presentation, and Imprivata will be reaching out to each of those audience members individually to make sure their questions are followed up on. So thank you again, and have a great rest of your day.
Hey, Randy, thanks for joining.